Before the tank, before the aircraft, there was the timetable. For a single century, the fate of nations was decided not on the battlefield, but on a stretch of steel rail, by who could move the most men, the fastest, to the right place first. This is the story of railways in war. For all of human history, an army could move only as fast as a marching soldier or a plodding mule. Logistics were dictated by the endurance of horses and men. Then came the steam locomotive, and everything changed. War stopped being a series of local, seasonal campaigns and became something continuous, industrial, total. The empire that mastered the rails could concentrate its whole strength in days and strike before its enemy had even assembled. The idea was ancient. Around 600 BCE, the Greeks built the dialkos, a stone trackway across the Isthmus of Corinth, hauling warships between two gulfs. But steam made it strategic. In 1846, Prussia moved roughly 12,000 troops, with horses, wagons, and artillery, 500 kilometers from Berlin to Krakow, in under a week. 9 years later, the railway reached the battlefield itself. Before Sevastopol in 1855, British engineers built the Grand Crimean Railway, a 7-mile tactical line, laid in just 7 weeks, from the port of Balaclava to the siege lines. It carried ammunition, siege guns, and rations forward, and evacuated the wounded back. The steel artery had been born. But the first true industrial rail war was fought in America between 1861 and 65. Across a continent too vast for wagons and rivers alone, railways became the backbone of strategy, for mobilization, for supply, for the movement of entire armies. And here the outcome would turn on a brutal industrial asymmetry. One side with the track, the locomotives, and the foundries to build more, the other slowly bleeding out. The numbers tell the story. The Union commanded roughly 22,000 miles of track for 119 locomotives, over 6,000 cars, and, from February 1862, the United States military railroads, which could seize and run any line. The Confederacy had barely 9,000 miles, fragmented, mismatched, and almost no foundries to replace what it lost. The Union's edge had a name: Herman Haupt and his construction corps. When retreating Confederates destroyed the Potomac Creek Bridge, Haupt's men, unskilled infantry, 2 million feet of local timber, rebuilt it in 9 days. 400 feet long, 100 feet high. Lincoln called it a bridge built of cornstalks and bean poles. Loaded trains crossed it every hour. And rail could do what no mule train ever could. In September 1863, the Union moved 20,000 men 1,233 miles in 11 days to relieve besieged Chattanooga. Longstreet's corps rode 900 miles to win Chickamauga, and Sherman supplied 100,000 men on one 473-mile line. By wagon, it would have taken 36,800 wagons. In Prussia, one man turned the railway into a weapon of pure planning. Helmuth von Moltke, chief of the General Staff from 1857, understood that industrial war would be won not by tactical brilliance, but by speed of mobilization. He built a dedicated railways department. Its task was chilling in its precision, to map every line, at home and abroad, and draft mobilization timetables down to the minute. Whoever concentrated first would win before the fighting even began. In 1866, against Austria, the theory met reality. Austria fed its army up a single, vulnerable line. Moltke used 5 separate railways, fanning his forces out to the frontier, then converging them in a concentric advance. His armies met, already concentrated, on the field at Königgrätz. The war was won in 6 weeks. 4 years later came the masterpiece. In the War of 1870, Moltke's railways department moved 1.2 million German troops and their artillery to the French frontier in a matter of weeks. French mobilization collapsed into chaos. Units stranded without rations or ammunition. The result: encirclements at Metz and Sedan, the capture of Napoleon III, and a united Germany. By 1914, all of Europe was chained to the timetable. Germany's Schlieffen Plan was, at heart, a railway plan, sweep through Belgium and beat France in the west before slow Russia could fully mobilize in the east. But the offensive outran its own railheads. The last mile, over roads torn apart by shellfire and rain, still depended on horse and truck and could not keep up. The advance stalled on the Marne, and the trenches began. The answer to that deadlock ran on tracks just 600 millimeters wide. Standard gauge railways were too big, too smoky, too visible near the front. So both sides laid light, portable, narrow-gauge lines, branching from the heavy railhead at the rear, forward over the cratered ground, straight to the artillery batteries and the front trench. The system came from the de Caval Company, militarized by a French officer, Prosper Petchet. Prefabricated 5-meter track sections that infantry could lay over mud. Steel well wagons carrying 5.5 tons of shells or hay. Smokeless petrol locomotives to stay hidden from observation balloons. The Canadian Corps used it to ferry millions of shells forward and keep their infantry rested. The lesson would be forgotten at terrible cost. In June 1941, Operation Barbarossa hurled deep armored thrusts hundreds of kilometers into the Soviet Union, aiming to encircle and destroy whole Soviet armies. Once again, the tanks outran their supplies. But this time the barrier was built into the very ground beneath them, a difference in the width of the rails that no plan had truly solved. Russia's railways were broad gauge, 1,524 millimeters. Germany's were standard, 1,435. German trains simply could not run east. Every ton had to be reloaded at the border. So engineering brigades re-gauged the track, pull the spikes, shift one rail inward 89 millimeters, re-spike. 20 kilometers a day, 15,000 kilometers by December. But the Germans had gambled on capturing Soviet trains and lost. In a colossal scorched earth evacuation, the Soviet Railway Ministry moved 1,500 factories, 10 million people, and most of the rolling stock eastward. The Germans seized only about 15% of the fleet. Then their own locomotives froze, water pipes cracking in the cold. Logistics collapsed before Moscow and Stalingrad. Where railways ruled, armies weaponized the trains themselves. Germany's Panzerzug 11, built on captured Polish stock, carried up to 4 75mm guns, anti-aircraft cannon, and sometimes a full tank riding a flat car. In the Slovak Uprising of 1944, resistance fighters built 3 armored trains at Zvolen, Herbin, Stefanik, and Masaryk, in under 2 weeks, from boilerplate and tank hulls. And the rails could carry monsters. The Schwerer Gustav, 800mm caliber, 1,350 tons, firing a 7,100-kilogram shell that pierced 7 meters of concrete. It needed a double track for 1,000 men to assemble it, 500 to fire it. At Sevastopol, it fired 47 rounds and wore out its barrel. The nimble Krupp K5 threw shells 64 kilometers on ordinary rails. Every strength was also a weakness. Cut the rail, and a whole army starved. Sherman knew simply bending rails wasn't enough. The enemy would heat and straighten them. So his men stacked wooden ties into a pyre, laid the rails across until they glowed red-hot, then twisted them into spirals. Sherman's neckties, a blockaded South, with no rolling mills, could never repair them. Others made an art of it. On the Hejaz Railway, 1,320 kilometers from Damascus to Medina, T.E. Lawrence kept the line barely running, pinning over 20,000 Ottoman troops to guard it. And on the Eastern Front, the Soviet rail war peaked with Operation Bagration, 9,500 explosions in a single night, paralyzing an entire German army group. After 1945, highways, trucks, and cargo aircraft gave armies back their freedom of movement. The golden age of the war train was over. Yet the railway left a permanent mark. Modern mobilization, logistics, the whole science of moving armies was forged on steel. For one extraordinary century, nations lived and died by the timetable.